Nuclear weapons can seriously compete with the internet and antibiotics for the title of the main invention in the history of mankind. It is almost impossible to find scientists who deny that atomic bombs caused a sharp decrease in the number of global conflicts in the middle of the last century. There are certainly many wars on the planet, but from the point of view of human history, nothing has changed. Unfortunately, there have always been wars, and probably will always be wars. Nuclear weapons have only reduced the number of wars on a huge scale. Everyone understands that battles with mutual annihilation are pointless, but whether this mutual annihilation is not a historical myth, whether the nuclear winter is real, this is what we will talk about in the next couple of minutes. Our first stop will be Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Of course, terrible, and fortunately the only catastrophes with the use of nuclear weapons. They are the easiest to use as a reference example, an example that instantly killed 80 people. According to the most conservative estimates, 80,000 people. The reality is that from the point of view of the Second World War, there was little difference between atomic weapons and classical bombings. February 13-14, 1945, as a result of the Allied raid on Dresden, killed about 100,000 people, and this is not even touching chemical weapons. It can easily compete with nuclear weapons. In 1935-36, 275,000 Ethiopians died from Italian chemical weapons. The number of victims of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki could not be compared. Not only with the main battles of the Second World War, but even with ordinary battles. In a couple of weeks, Bialystok from the Battle of Camino, the USSR alone lost 341,000 people and atomic bombing losses. That's not what made Japan surrender. They lost much more. People from conventional bombing and surrendered because of the USSR's entry into the war. That's what Emperor Hirohito called the main reason in his statement on August 171,945. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not mentioned in the paper at all. ASC for the subsequent events. The fact that nobody really knew how many atomic weapons the USA had and was not aware of the real scale of destruction played a role in fostering fear of atomic weapons. It consists in the fact that the bombing supposedly wipes out entire cities from the face of the earth, making the space uninhabited. In reality, everything is again not quite so with an air blast with a power of a megaton. The zone of complete destruction is less than 4 km on average at a TE. Distance of 10 km, only 5% of the population will die. And this is about a classic modern bomb dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were 10 times weaker. The main striking factor in Hiroshima was the fire. Because the building was typical Japanese, wooden and cardboard, the geographical location played a role. Because in hilly Nagasaki, in other words, atomic bombs are scary, but they don't turn huge cities into dust. You can say that it's not a problem. Because since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the nuclear potential of countries has increased many times, and mankind can throw bombs at each other. This is also a myth, because nuclear weapons are insanely expensive. You can often find statements that the bombing of Tokyo in World War I was the result of the work of thousands of people, and Hiroshima and Nagasaki were defeated with just one bomb. Nuclear weapons are much cheaper to fight with than nuclear weapons, which is not true at all, because the Manhattan Project budget in 1945 was 90% of the total cost of small arms and almost 40% of the total cost of these two bombs, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, cost. Like tens of thousands of tanks and airplanes, and it cost like 9 out of 10 rifles produced in the USA, and it is only a bomb that still needs to be delivered. The budget for the creation of the B-29 bomber is even more than the atomic bomb, and in general is considered the most expensive project of the Second World War. Let's say you say that it's a question of development of the further production is easier. This is also a mistake, because the production of atomic bombs is insanely expensive, And most importantly, it must be constantly maintained. For example, now the USA is modernizing nuclear warheads W-80, and each will require $75 million, according to calculations from the book of nuclear expert Stephen Schwar from 1940 to 1998. The U.S. spent $5 trillion on its nuclear arsenal. For comparison, this is 25 annual military budgets of China for 2021. In general, to call atomic weapons cheap is not the right word, and the USA and other countries do not reduce nuclear potentials out of the goodness of their hearts. If atomic weapons were so cheap and simple, these potentials would only increase. We are not so naive to believe in humanism and the destruction of nuclear arsenals for the sake of humanity, right? If you still have doubts, the following myth will dispel the opinion. It consists in the simplicity and safety of nuclear weapons. Allegedly, without fuses, you can play soccer and nothing will happen. Partly true, but in life, everything is much more complicated, and there are many incidents related to nuclear weapons in history. For example, the investigation of the Portal to National Interest showed that at least 1,200 USA nuclear weapons from 1950 to 68 were involved in dangerous incidents. And by that, we mean not spilled tea on the warhead. In 1980, a worker in Arkansas dropped a wrench into the silo of a Taton I missile. It punctured the rocket's first stage tank, causing a leak, and personnel were evacuated immediately. But at 3 a.m. on September 19, a missile with a W-53 nuclear warhead exploded, blowing the 740-ton lid off the silo like a balloon. So the next time you scold yourself for hands growing out of the wrong place, remember the worker with the wrench? There was another equally dramatic story on January 24, 1961. A B-52 plane was carrying 2 thermonuclear bombs 260 times more powerful than those that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A fuel leak was discovered, which led to the destruction of the plane and the death of the crew. The bombs were detached from the airplanes, according to the instructions, but the parachute opened only on one of the 2 bombs, and also 3 of the 4 fuses were disconnected. Putting the bomb on alert, only a low-voltage switch saved the U.S. from a catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. Well, the second bomb was scattered, so the plutonium charge and a pile of radioactive debris had to be searched for by engineering troops. And now remember that similar to these incidents, only for 17 years, uncounted more than 1,000. And the question of why countries reducing nuclear weapons will be solved by itself. It is insanely expensive, dangerous, and can lead to unrealistic consequences. With this, we think we have sorted out and moved on to other myths, for example, about irretrievable radioactive contamination of the area. A small spoiler, maybe. The fact that now Hiroshima and Nagasaki are quite populated. Well, if you look in detail, the intensity of radiation in 7 hours after the explosion of a nuclear bomb drops 10 times. Then after 9 hours, 100, and after 343 hours, 1,000 times, between 1,945 and 70 years among survivors. Of the bombing of the Japanese, the number of leukemia exceeded the norm twice. It's scary, but still we are talking about no more than a percentage of the total number. Moreover, during the year after the bombing, Hiroshima was controlled by 40,000 American soldiers, and radiation sickness was not known at that time, and they walked in ordinary clothes, and still no mass mortality was recorded. Again, we once again remind about exclusively wooden cities without specialized shelters. If they had been in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the figures of losses would have been quite different. On Bikini Atoll, for example, the Americans tested a 15-megaton hydrogen bomb, and 4 years after the explosion, the arriving biologists discovered something funny. right in the crater of the explosion-meter-long corals were blooming and the underwater ecosystem was completely restored. Well, to summarize, the myth that nuclear war will split the Earth was invented during the Cold War.